Hi. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Ethically created and distributed synthetic voice and voice cloning. It's a topic near and dear to our hearts. I am Ashley Bailey, the Senior Product Marketing Manager for Veritone for Marvel.ai, which is our synthetic voice cloning solution. And here with me is Lauren Cowles, who is the Program Director of Synthetic Voice at Veritone. Bryan Barletta, founder of Sounds Profitable podcast. And Jennifer Kady, Vice President of IBM. And Jon Stine, who's the Executive Director of the Open Voice Network, whom many of you probably already know. Synthetic voice and voice cloning, there's deep fake, right? And everyone is very worried and concerned about deep fake, as are we. And it's very hard to break through and really get to the underlying technology of what deep fake is, and that's synthetic voice and the voice cloning when there's fraudulent activities and criminal activities and malicious with, Tom Cruise on TikTok, who was not Tom Cruise and who did not authorize that. So we want to really just get into some of the governance, ethics, best practices, and good and positive use cases around synthetic voice and voice technology in government, media, and entertainment, and kind of demystify the deep fake. And we'll talk about it and we'll address it, but kind of demystify the subject as well. So we will get into that right now. I will hand it over to everyone to just do brief introductions first.
Sure. Thanks, Ashley. I'm Lauren. I work with Ashley at Veritone. Veritone is, we like to call it the first software for AI. So we have a product called AIware. It's a full suite and solution of different transcription, translation engines that, instead of going to a point solution, you can come to Veritone and we can kind of provide structure to unstructured data. Marvel.ai is actually our first content creation tool, and we're very excited about it. It launched this year in May, and it is a synthetic voice cloning solution. So we can take, a couple hours of anyone's voice and then create a synthetic model of that voice and then create net new content throughout that model. So I'm excited to just get into that a little bit. I'm our program director at Veritone for that particular product line, and so I oversee a lot of the voice creation and consent and clearance and some of our voice workflows to then push that voice to different applications or conversational AI platforms. So looking forward to this panel.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Bryan. I'm the founder of Sounds Profitable. It's a podcast and newsletter all about podcast, ad tech, and advertising. And I try and be a use case for all the different companies in the industry to try and show off how the tech works and talk about the value for the whole industry that segment of tech or whatnot can work, right? We should all be bettering the space and we should all be learning about as much of it as possible. And I had a chance to work with the Marvel.ai team, and they made a synthetic version of my voice, which we'll talk about. And it's been very, very fun to be involved in this as we evaluate the uses for, podcasting for content or advertising.
I'm Jennifer Kady. So I'm a worldwide vice president for our data and AI at IBM. I've been in this field as well as in security for the better part of a decade and a half. And the focus that I've had most recently, especially with respect to AI, is governance, and not just the governance, but also the cleansing, and how important it is not to just, ethically, not to just have some of this technology that we have develop and sit, but also what are we doing and how are we cleansing that data? Who has access to that data? Should they have access to that data? And should we be keeping and collecting as a technology community that content? So my focus has been not so much on the development side of the AI, although we've got a full suite that we can certainly speak to, but also on the ethics and what is important about what we do as a humanity with that content, and how can we be good stewards of this type of technology.
And I'm Jon Stine, an executive director of the Open Voice Network. We're a Linux Foundation nonprofit community. And we're responsible for putting into structure and putting into practice answering the kind of questions that Jennifer is bringing up, and especially in the ethics of the use of voice data, voice conversations and utterances, and certainly the big question of synthetic voice, which we're gathering today. So delighted to be part of this.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you all so much.
Sure.
So first I want to talk about voice and the reality of the shift that we've experienced, not only in the last 5 years, but in the last 18 months, as we've just been advancing so quickly and trying to catch up to ourselves, really. So I'd just love to get everybody's take on this and just kind of a round robin discussion. So we'll start with you, Lauren.
Sure, yeah. I think voice is definitely like a tool now, and it's like it's an accessibility tool. It's the way people get their news and their weather and all of their information, whether it's through like a Google assistant or an Alexa assistant. You wake up in the morning and you say, "Good morning, Alexa," and she's like, "Here's your commute, here's your schedule, here's this, here's that." So we're using voice not so much as a novelty anymore to like, have your friend record your voicemail and it's like a fun gag. It's like we're really using that as a tool to access information, and especially, from the development perspective, we develop skills for Amazon and Google marketplaces, and we just recently pushed one in the healthcare space for our client AbbVie, where you can take an assessment to see if your symptoms could be something more than just like an occasional flare-up or irritation. And so people are using their voice now to get more information about themselves, about the world around them, to connect more, and it's really, more of this accessibility tool using your voice. Like our EVP, Sean King, who's giving a keynote later this week, will actually use this metaphor, and I really like it, and it's powerful to me, is, he says, like, what the mouse was to the computer or the remote was to your TV, like, your voice is now to unlock all of these different tools and channels that we're really seeing in the last year or so through these different connected devices.
I have 2 children, so I often have no hands. And so being able to communicate through my watch, my headphones, my phone, to use that as the mouse has been amazing, right? The amount of things I've been able to interact with without completely neglecting my kids in those scenarios. And then for the content consumption, right? Like I shaved my head because I was tired of being on video and seeing my receding hairline. And so in a world where you can walk away from your computer and be on a conference call, or you can digest something through a podcast or audio, it's, for so many people, I think audio and voice is becoming input and output of a preferred method. And it allows you to really regulate how much you're putting out there, because you can mute and you can be off screen and you can consume it when works for you.
Yeah, I know just from the past 18 months, just from an experience of what we've been doing in and of ourselves with masks, not being able to see each other, not being able to necessarily hear each other in person, we've also seen this extensive move of employees, people wanting to shift and change jobs, change roles. So the hiring has been massive and challenged. We've been working with McDonald's on screens because they cannot hire fast enough to have people taking orders and working, just working customer service. So we're working with McDonald's on the ability to drive up. I use my voice and I place my order. The feedback comes back to them real time. Questions are asked through the AI, through the AI engine, but there's also a lot of implications with that. Again, how do we collect that content? How do we keep that data? I'm going to be paying, so presumably you know my voice. You're keeping my voice on file for what? For future marketing, for future initiatives? How do we not only leverage and use this technology, which, by the way, I think it's fantastic. I don't have to touch things. It's an ability for me to try to keep sanitary as well. But also at the same time, how do I make sure that data is concretely handled? And then also, I guess the other ethical part of this is, am I augmenting our humans who are doing the work, or am I taking away from that energy, from their employment? And how do we work through the balance of all of those different types of scenarios? That's what, especially from the pandemic and some of the outputs, that's one of the things that I found, we've been involved with, but also incredibly interesting.
I'll riff off Jennifer again, and I think that again, to many of the conversations here, and I wish I had the courage to shave my head. But we're at a real inflection point of voice interfaces, broadly moving from a toy to a tool. And when it moves from a toy, oh, isn't that cute, watch this, to it's a tool because I'm now using voice interfaces and voice data analysis
Right.
to not only understand the order, but then to have a greater understanding of all the orders by time, by content, by this, by that. Now we're, as Jennifer, you so well put, we're entering a new realm of understanding business value, and certainly asking critical ethical questions. Because not only could I understand and analyze the order, but I could start to analyze, someone had a cough when they gave that order, now what do we do? So again, from a toy to a tool, we're in that transition right now. And when we are in that transition, all these new questions now emerge.
Which, and again, what data is appropriate to keep?
What is appropriate to keep, what's appropriate to use, who has access, who's going to claim it.
Right.
All those are critical issues.
Yeah, absolutely. Getting into another round robin style, and then I'll have a few specific questions for everyone. Understanding that we have all had different experiences here. Can you remember the first time you heard about synthetic media, or somebody might have called it a deep fake because that's the more common term? Like, can you remember that time and what your first reaction was? Like your first initial reaction.
I don't know if I can remember my first like deep fake per se, but I think the first time I can think about like interacting with a synthetic voice is probably, we all interact with it on the regular through like IVR systems, which can be so frustrating, and you're like, speak to representative, like 0, 0, 0 over and over again, because they really lacked the humanity of, speaking to a person, and they really lacked like any diversity as well. Like I couldn't, if you were calling from a specific region, you only had English or Spanish, but within Spanish, you couldn't choose like Guatemala, Honduras, Bolivia, Argentina, like where the dialects and pronunciations and even colloquialisms and things like that are so different. I think in the beginning it was just very like not human, not diverse, and so I'm excited with advancements we have in that realm, I would say.
Yeah, I think the first time that like really sticks out for me, like past that type of example, because it's good. That's probably the first one. Is I saw like a deep fake of Back to the Future with Robert Downey Jr. and Tom Holland, and I was just like, this is wrong, but I also want this to be a movie.
I would pay
and
to
it like made me really think about like, how does that work, right? Who owns the rights to it? Should this exist? Will this get taken down? And all that. And I thought it was interesting, and it's really where it sparked for me, like, what's next? How do we govern it? How do we make sure it's done ethically?
Yeah, I have the same early experiences. One that's been more affecting for me as a person. A very good friend is she's a voice actor, and on TikTok her voice was completely exploited.
Yes.
Completely, and that's your ICAP. That's how do I protect? How do I copyright? What can I do to protect me, my voice as intellectual property? And how do I fight against a nation state that steals it?
Yeah.
That was probably one of the things that affected me more. But I want more of the Tom
Right?
Downey Jr.
Right?
Absolutely. But I also, you're right, how do we protect some of this content?
A number of years ago, when I was working for the Intel Corporation and working in retail technology, I was in a test store in Suzhou, China. And that test store was set up where you paid by your face. Facial recognition. And then that was linked to your account. And so you picked up the football jersey and you looked up, bink, and then you paid. You walked out. And then it was a test. And then speaking with the technologists, they said, and we're working to make sure that we won't be faked. This is 2013, 2014. And wait a minute. And we got into deep fake visuals. And then, wait a minute, if you can deep fake visuals, you can deep fake on and on and on. What are the implications? What are the uses? And if it's AI, we've all been trained to know AI can be good, AI can be bad. It's the intent of the user and the context and the transparency. I thought, oh my God, this is brave new world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's parts of bioengineering that we've purposefully gotten out of. So facial engineering, you saw that, I think the New England Patriots a couple of years ago when they were looking through mugshots and those guys, there's like 3 football players who were targeted. How do you handle some of the ethics in the space?
It's brave new world. So it's questions that must be addressed.
Yeah.
Again, as we move from toy to tool.
Sure.
Yeah, and that kind of brings me to the next question. I mean, especially when a lot of our first reactions were like, ugh, I don't know about that. Bryan, I wanted to ask you if since you have a synthetic version of your voice, have you received any concerns from your audience about, I can't believe you did that, or what?
Yeah. So, I mean, my audience is people who work from mid to enterprise level in podcast advertising and ad tech. And they're all people that need to know about these tools and how to use them. And the goal was that we would make a synthetic version of my voice and we would broadcast it, so that have me speak Spanish and have the newsletter translated in Spanish. So there's 2 pieces of my writing and my voice being out every week in another language and not me speaking it. And, when we wrote about it, I think I could cut half that article out if I just stopped double checking with everybody reading it, because I was waiting for the negative. And I didn't get it. Like we have, almost 50 people signed up for the newsletter in Spanish. We have about that on the podcast too, and a very niche topic, right? Sure. And so it's all been positive. The worst that happened was someone wrote grosso as a response on Twitter, and I was like, what did I do? And they're like, no, to me that's like sick, that's cool. Like, and I was like, oh, I literally translated that, and I assumed that you were disgusted by this, but it gets shared. It's probably one of my most viewed articles, and I mean, I think that everybody's really bought into it. No, nothing negative. I was honestly shocked.
Yeah. You do a good job though being like very upfront with your audience about it
Yeah.
too. Like, just because we work closely together, I'm familiar with the project, but every article is like, this is a synthetic version of my voice, using this technology, blah, blah, blah. Like, you're never trying to trick anyone.
Well, when we're talking about consent of like, who has access to my voice, one of the other things that was really important to me was, of my readers, am I deceiving them?
Sure.
And they did Luke Skywalker and The Mandalorian, and they're like, it's movie magic. We don't want to disclose it. And I was like, okay. I mean, I kind of get that, and I'm okay with that. But what happens if I'm just not comfortable with it? What type of warning should I get?
Yeah.
And so I wanted to, like, everything kicks off with me in Spanish saying, this is a synthetic voice. I have given my approval, all that, and in the translated text it says that too. So if anybody's not comfortable with it, they can opt out. Like, they don't have to be there from the start.
It's a very important, and you mentioned several things, and I want to point out Awita Coleman, who's in the audience here, and she leads the work on privacy, security, and ethics in the Open Voice Network, and the issues of transparency, the issues of consent, the issues of consent that is easily understood, all become very important as we discuss this topic. The Mandalorian, great, cool, show it to me, but, it's okay. Tell me it's a synthetic voice.
Yeah.
It doesn't take away the magic,
No.
but just tell me. Make sure that I'm aware. And again, bringing those critical issues of transparency and consent, creating trust about this technology. I mean, we can all think, and Ashley, you were asking, or made the comment, oh my God, it's a deep fake, it's bad. This is bad. I'm talking to a clinician at something called United Abilities in Birmingham, Alabama. They work with cerebral palsy patients. You're working with synthetic voice. Oh my God, I have children who would love to have a voice. Who do you know that could help give these children and adults a voice? So again, takes multiple perspectives.
Absolutely.
Amazing, amazing use case right there. But I wanted to dig in a little bit more, Jon, with you, and just your quest in the Open Voice Network, and kind of just a little bit more, if you could dive a little bit deeper into, your mission.
We set up a synthetic voice study group, and because of the hanging questions, oh my God, you're dealing with deep fakes. And I think it's incumbent upon us to raise the questions and explore them. And do that in a neutral, tech-friendly, but tech-neutral way. But what are the questions? What are the issues? What are the fears? What are the potential harms? And what are the benefits? And begin to document those and educate. And so we're on a path, as Ashley, as you know, of education, a white paper. We're doing a kind of a test prototype of this is how you do a synthetic voice with 2 great voice actors. And again, as part of our mission of educating and then asking the question, might standards or some guidance, some governance, to your point, might that be valuable within the broader community? We think so. We have 2 or 3 ideas, maybe watermarks, maybe a number of things. Don't know. But again, we're exploring that, Ashley, to your good question, and thank you for asking it.
Yeah, and then this is kind of a broad question, Jennifer, so I apologize in advance.
Okay.
But how do you view responsibility for use as a technology creator?
So as a creator, I mean, I can talk to myself personally, but I think more so as all of us as technologists. And as annoying and frustrating as NIST and GDPR and all those, the regulatory can be, I do think that those are a necessity in our field.
Absolutely.
And whether it's absolutely governed by this is law or such as NIST, this is a protocol that we highly recommend that you follow. I think having that and the continuous evolution of a group such as yourself, who helps to bring us into in a line, so to speak. It also gives, I think, the consumers and us as consumers an ability to be able to better understand what is the lineage of what I am participating in. When I am getting these opt-in, opt-out type of questions, how do I understand? I can understand that better because it becomes part of our regular vernacular. I mean, 10, 15 years ago, I was working with CISOs who were they weren't even really CISOs. It was security officers. It was backroom. This stuff was not anything in security. Wasn't necessarily out on the table in the room. Now all of us absolutely know when we think we're being tripped up in a phishing attack. When we know we shouldn't click on something. Yeah. It becomes part of our everyday vernacular. It's a brave new world, but it also has to become something that is more normalized. And I think us as technologists do need to be governed because there is so much that we can do with this. And some of it will be, I mean, there are going to be things that we're going to do that are going to be so much for the benefit and betterment of us as a society, but I'm positive that there are actors that don't necessarily have that same expectation, that they don't hold themselves to that standard. Us having standards like that, especially within each of the different countries, governments that choose to do so, I think it's important and valuable for us as citizens to be mindful and respectful of a legislation that's trying to do that for us.
That's a great example too with email, because it's another one where the technology is neutral. There's a lot of bad actors
Absolutely.
out there, with, phishing and scamming and all of that, where we have to be very mindful. And now we're kind of trained to keep our eye out for it.
Sure.
But there's still bad actors.
Social
out there.
engineering. I mean, you can be picking up one of the things in security that we were seeing is with voice recognition, calls that you might be getting from someone that you could recognize, and you start to feed information that you never, but you're not actually on the phone with anyone.
Right.
And that is, there's just different imperatives, and we can't live in a lockdown world either. I mean, it can be a very, we saw it with COVID, it can be a very isolating place to be. We don't need that either, but we do need to live in some sort of vernacular that all of us can understand and opt in and opt out of.
Absolutely. My next question for you, Lauren, the ethics, as we've been talking about, the ethics around synthetic voice is a growing conversation globally. How have you been navigating this at Veritone, and can you share some frequently asked questions, because I know you get a lot, and how vendors can tackle them from a contractual perspective and a technology perspective?
Yeah, sure. I'll take that in parts. So when we are on a call with like a prospective customer and we're talking about capabilities with synthetic voice, they're always like, this is amazing, this is so cool, can you do Robert Downey Jr.? And it's like, technically, yes, the technology would support that, but with Veritone, and because it's a brave new world and all of this is so new, we're trying to set like an exemplary standard where it's like, just because we can do Robert Downey Jr. doesn't mean we should.
Right.
And contractually, how we work through this process at Veritone is we need 2 forms of consent from the voice owner. One is an audio file that says, like, I, Jon Stine, the owner of the voice you're listening to, for verification purposes. The second is a consent agreement. And, in the Robert Downey Jr. example, if we were able to talk to his folks and his people and he's interested, there's a couple layers that we work through with consent. So in that particular example, the way our forms work, there's a couple layers. The voice owner, in this case Robert Downey Jr., is giving permission to, let's say, Disney, which is an entity, to create content with his synthetic voice. And our form says that Robert Downey Jr. is giving permission to Disney to create these clips, and Robert Downey Jr. is giving Veritone permission to create the code of the voice. So in terms of like ownership and IP and all of that, all that we own as the development arm is the code of the voice. It won't work on anyone else's system, so we have to host it. But if Robert Downey Jr. is done playing at any point, that voice model is destroyed and destructed, and that code no longer exists anymore. And the consent between Robert Downey Jr. and Disney also governs our hosting of that code. If for any reason Robert Downey Jr. and Disney split ways, then our contract is now null. Nobody else can come in and use his voice because he only granted permission to the Disney entity. So, sometimes clients get frustrated because they're like, oh, this is, so much legal to understand, and we have to get all of these attorneys involved in blah, blah, blah. But it's really just because we're trying to protect that end talent, Robert Downey Jr., and if he wanted to give consent to Disney and then consent to another company and another company, those are all layers, but we could create multiple voices for him that only those companies would have access to. It's not like he's creating a synthetic voice and then anyone can go in and use it. He's giving specific consent to a specific entity to create clips through that voice. So there's layers to it, and we always make sure that the voice owner themselves is aware of what we're doing and the process and who will have access and their intention behind it. And we recommend that Robert Downey Jr. and Disney have their own specific agreement on what they're going to be doing with that voice. We are just the provider in this sense. But we are trying to make a standard of this, especially because everything is so new. We want to just be exemplary in the fact that there's a ton of competitors out there that do create synthetic voice, and I've actually gone onto their sites and made my own different celebrities, and those celebrities have no idea that we've done all of that. And so that's, I think, what makes people uncomfortable. Sure. So from our perspective, we are putting a lot of these hoops in place just to make sure all parties are aware, all parties are comfortable, and then we progress. So folks can get a little bit frustrated, I just want to hear my voice, I just want to make it, but we're laying the groundwork for this foundation. That way in the future, in partnership with Open Voice and these different agencies, that we can kind of set a precedent for all of this moving forward, especially since your voice is your identity and your biomarker and all of that. We just want to make sure that the consent is in place before we move forward with any projects.
And since you had experience with this firsthand, Bryan, what was one of the most important things, or a couple things that were very important to you when working the contract?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I got reached out to by a lot of synthetic voice companies. We'd had a working relationship already, so when I talked to you about it, I was excited. But there were some that were just cool, in the next meeting we'll bring your clone voice. I said, no, thank you. I wasn't really interested in that, and
right.
There was a lot. I had to sign and read and sign something, and I had to record that watermark, which was very cool. And just knowing that if I'm just hey, I'm done, it's it's gone. And knowing that there's a path for me to license it out as the content creator, the pushback I immediately expected was this replaces jobs, right? And I think for a very small amount of things it might, but it creates so many more, right? We're creating a new instrument. The text-to-speech aspect and all the tools there's some people are going to become masters of that, being able to really do creative things with it. The speech to speech mapping, right? That aspect there. Someone who's really good at impersonations and accents can then be that person that you map the celebrities' voices to. Translation and localization. I think it's so cool, and that all of that, like, I think at one point I was just like, yeah, send over the legal, let's make the voice, and you're like, no, we're gonna go through all of it. And afterwards I was like, I'm really glad this is your approach, because everybody else really did want to just come with my voice. And I think getting right to the creator and making sure that they own that, while the studios, while the other people will want to own that, getting right to the creator will block out the bad actors. Having watermarks and other things like that will make it easier for us to build detection. And as it becomes a tool and not a toy, it'll be less expensive for us to monitor everything and auto detect those things and do takedowns and whatnot than it is right now to like be reactionary.
Yeah, you have control for yourself.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, we're working definitely to be able to detect synthetic speech in the future. What we do in the meanwhile, the watermark keeps coming up. So I'll just explain that a bit, but any synthetic clip created through our software is embedded with an inaudible watermark, which is just a signal that we embed at a very low frequency across a very long bandwidth, so that it's really a policing play on our side, so that if Robert Downey Jr. came up to us and was like, hey, there's all these weird clips out, I'm not sure where they came from, we could actually take a look at the file and trace that back and say, oh, that did come from our software, or oh, that didn't. And to destroy that watermark is very difficult. You would have to put a large noise signal over the entire clip, which it effectively destroys the clip anyways. So once our clips are created and watermarked, there's no way to like extract that watermark, so we can police a bit better just to know what's created through our software and what isn't. In the case where like, oh, Disney owns everything they create through our software, it's their IP, they got his permission to use the voice, but one step further, they can actually examine all of the files to make sure how they were created and where they were sourced from.
Any other best practices that you would recommend to podcasters specifically who are navigating, want to navigate this, or want to have their podcast in Spanish or French? Or
I want more people to do it. I like being the test case for podcast industry to using new tech, because like I could call Lauren up and we could be in a different language next week, right? And it's just the presentation is the example. It's the first step forward. And it invites the ability to go from taking my voice and putting it in another language to expanding Sounds Profitable into another language natively there. Like, it just allows me to explore as much as possible. I really think that the price point is becoming accessible for any business in podcasting, and it's going to become a no-brainer very soon.
And John, you mentioned this already, kind of witnessing these contracts evolve firsthand. What are some of the most challenging hurdles that you've witnessed and that you've seen them have to overcome between vendor and voice artist?
We started our synthetic voice group. We had 15, 18 individuals on a Zoom call, and maybe half of those individuals were voice artists from around the world. We're calling in from Italy, from Australia at 2 a.m., everywhere. And the initial thing, Ashley, to your very good question, was, oh my God, this is going to take away my job. And there, you could sense in the questions and the comments, there was that overarching fear. And as we began to explore the ideas of transparency and consent, the type of contracts and agreements that you were mentioning a moment ago, you could see the temperature begin to decline. And people, well, this might work. And then we realized that synthetic voice, to your very good point, if we think that the overall use of voice and audio is going to be constant, well, maybe it'll take away jobs. But if we see a world of podcasting and audio and voice increasing, my gosh, I have more opportunities than I thought.
Right, yeah.
This could really expand my market. And so we've gone from, I'm here because I'm going to protect my interests, to let's find a way to make this work because it will work for all of us. And this could be a very valuable, again, with the legal protections, with the transparency, with the consent, with the awareness of how this is going to work. This is a great opportunity. And it's been a very interesting, Ashley, to your question, a very interesting transition through a span of what we had, 10, 12 meetings, from here to there.
Go ahead.
It expands your productivity,
Yeah.
frankly. I mean, you're getting royalty, it expands your productivity. You're reaching markets you never would have had an opportunity
Never
to
thought.
do in the past.
Never thought.
And that's for you as talent. I'm thinking also in terms of business to consumer, as a consumer being able to go out and use my voice in another country without having to use like the silly, I'm trying to translate and it's coming in like I can use my own voice and I can speak we can all be, the world becomes a lot smaller and we can communicate so much better. But I just think the productivity angle on this is massive as opposed to losing jobs.
To that point, a story. We have a Toronto-based voice artist working with a UK-based speech synthesizer that does all kinds of work in Johannesburg.
Wow.
With banks and with hospitals. Now, all of a sudden, boom, 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 she's gone from, well, can I get this job in Ottawa to, Cape Town, Johannesburg.
Right.
Yeah. I look like I play a lot of video games because I do, and the voices change in different countries. The voiceover artists, and so being able to like get that gig and being able to have your voice and personality translated into another language, and then not only just text to speech on that end, but now you're empowering another person who can speak with imitate you in that language. Yeah, you create a job and you manage to hold on to your IP.
Sure.
Squid Game. Like, imagine that in a dub that's actually their voices, right? Like I'm excited that Sounds Profitable is in other languages, but my real dream is that someone who speaks another language goes, oh, I can do the same content he does, but in English now. And then I get to learn from them. Like, my content doesn't struggle to get out there. I want other ideas. That's what I'm really excited about.
Very exciting.
And from the consumer perspective, question for you, Jennifer. What are some of the ways consumers can be smart about the content that they're taking in? And are there some ways that they can detect if something is synthetic?
Sure.
If it's synthetic, is it verified?
Right.
Is it malicious? So just kind of...
I think from a consumer standpoint, it's going to take some time. It depends. It's going to really depend upon the grade level of what your familiarity is in this particular space. I think as actors, as talent, you absolutely have to understand the legality of what you're getting yourself into, and be ready and be prolific with protecting yourself. I think from us, or some of us, I'm not talent necessarily.
I'm barely talent. I'm a tech demo.
Well, but me on the recipient side, where I may or may not fully understand what it is that I think understanding and in continuous education is going to be very important. I think we're sort of at that burgeoning point where we were 10, 15 years ago in cyber, and now we're here. And what we know now is so much more. We're so much better than what we were, again, years ago. What we are now is, I think, almost in its infancy, and so we're going to need to understand that better. But knowing lineage, knowing who it is that you're, in that outreach, who it is that you're receiving that outreach from. If I'm choosing to participate, you're choosing to participate, and you need to understand that is, you do have a choice in doing so. You may miss out. If you're choosing to be on TikTok, and my goodness, I have 3 daughters, and they love every minute of it, but that gets put out there, that is no longer yours necessarily. Yeah. You're choosing to do that. So understanding that we're making choices and have decisions, you don't have to participate. You can opt out at any time. You can get off Facebook. You can get off TikTok. You can do all of these things. If you want to be in there, though, you do need to understand who it is that you're working with and what rights you are giving up in doing so.
So it's neat that my phone will now tell me it's a scam call, which should just be what it says when it rings anytime. But as my AirPods have pass through, and my watch can listen, and all these devices are happening. Do you think we'll get to a point where the devices can let us know that as a consumer protection?
Well, there's certain things that are already happening. They're letting you know, but you don't realize maybe that they're letting you know. They're listening. Yeah. And we're getting the pop-up messages. We're getting the marketing. So it's already happening. In terms of that opt-in and what the from a device manufacturing standpoint, and again from the technology standpoint, I think that is something that we should be expecting. I think that is a right that we have to know that I am being manipulated, and when and where and how I'm being manipulated.
Yeah.
And I think that we do know some of those actors that are doing that to us already. And if we choose to participate again, it's our choice.
Yeah.
But yeah, I do believe that is something that is, it should be expected, and I believe it's coming.
Using the word manipulated, I think, is really strong and powerful, and needs to be there, because you can choose to. Like, you go to a magic show, you're choosing to be manipulated
Exactly.
and you're buying into it.
Yes.
It's about how you feel about it in that situation.
It's
and
your
that's-
awareness that you are.
Yes.
I want to be manipulated. Take me to the hypnotist.
Yep.
Yes.
100%.
Yes.
Right. And I mean, I don't want to politicize it, but the minute it gets into a political conversation, suddenly it spins into me versus you, and that's not it. This is truly about how me as a person, how I am being affected in all of this different technology, and you have a choice. You can opt in or you opt out.
Yeah.
Lauren, can you walk us through a couple of the positive use cases for good, as we say, and since we are where we are, maybe a couple in government, and then we'll do a couple of closing questions for the group.
Sure, totally. Happy to. Use cases for good, I think definitely, to Brian's point, is like the localization and the creation of content in different languages for folks to choose what language they want to engage with content in, and just making that content more accessible to more people in their native language. So we see this a lot in, the for good use cases, in education, like training courses, e-learning materials, so that students can understand the full impact of, what they're learning in their own tongue. So definitely e-learning and education. In government, definitely we get this a lot in terms of like public safety or announcements, where especially, in COVID, for example, Korea is really good at digitizing all of their content, and because of that, they have kind of the disease management under control because they are disseminating content so quickly in digital formats. And, I think with synthetic voice, you could create PSAs and awareness things in a handful of different languages all at the same time, and disseminate those and share them out so quickly, versus like, here's my English version, now I have to find someone to translate that into all of these different dialects and regions for every one of my constituents, and then by the time I finally get that out, that news and that important update is kind of delayed. And so I think it's creating content in a handful of languages, in near real time, and then being able to disseminate that information to, stop the spread of misinformation or get, public safety information out. I think that's where it could play a big piece in government for sure.
Absolutely. Then a couple of closing questions. What do technology companies need to do and assist in the governance around synthetic voice? We've kind of already talked a lot about it, but maybe just touch on, maybe everyone could just emphasize something or touch on something.
Yeah. So from like the technology provider perspective, like I mentioned, we will never create a synthetic voice that wasn't authorized by the voice owner. And then once that voice is created, the people who have access to that voice is very controlled and locked down. So we like to say, we are the voice guardians in this space. Like, we'll create your voice, and then we'll make it available only to those specific individuals that you have authorized to have access to it. So we try to keep everything as locked down as possible, at least in the Veritone systems.
Yeah. Adding to that, if I was licensing my voice out, having some sort of audit log, being able to understand what was built with my voice and review it, and make sure that it was, from the tech creator, not the person who licensed it, sharing it back with me, so I could make sure that it was, above board, it hit the contract requirements.
I'll speak to it as a consumer. I think that we need to raise the bar as far as our expectations of technologists, and that we need to insist that this be in a language that we can all understand and appreciate, and that ultimately that vernacular becomes more clear in when I want to participate or when I don't.
I would say join the Open Voice Network.
Let's do it.
But we collectively, and again, this is very selfish coming from me, but we collectively need a neutral place to address the questions. where we can debate back and forth and come up with communally, not from on high, not from down the road here at the Capitol, but communally say these are the issues and this is how we can address them and govern them. And here's a structure that allows us to do that in a way that lifts boats, respects the rights and promotes the values that we all share. So, talk to me.
Well,
Doors open.
I think that's really powerful because, like, I look at, you mentioned, like, the legal governance and whatnot. Like, when I get a cookie pop up, when I get the opt out, like, if you don't respond, how do you interpret that? What is that? What's next? Like, and the initial request at that time, there's still ads, they're still using your information, and it's messy and it's legal. And then the other side, like, I'm involved with the IAB on the podcast side, and like, there's money controlling that versus the government side of it.
Absolutely.
And so the idea of what you're talking about is really attractive. I mean, it's hard to be in this space and just be like believe, but it's worth trying. It's worth doing it. You know what I mean? Like, it's worth giving it a shot because it is neutral. Everybody's passionate about it. And the technology people are bought in.
If we don't give it a shot, ain't gonna happen.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
I wish more industries did things like that.
Absolutely.
As we close here, I just want to see, because I think we're at almost time, if anybody has any questions for any of the panelists.
You kind of hit on voice as a service, your product, but can you talk more about the intellectual property components of it?
Yeah, so I'll repeat for what's being recorded, just hitting on the IP, intellectual property side.
Yeah, of course. So, the entity that has the permission to create that voice ultimately owns the content and the clips that are created through that voice, but the voice owner is, not waiving their right, but they have an understanding that that entity will create whatever content it is that they have approved them to create in that voice. We also have a compliance and, a licensing and clearance arm where we can help maintain and make sure that all of, the places that you are licensing your voice is licensing them in a way that you have provided your consent to be licensed. So we have a compliance factor as well to make sure that, whatever agreement it is that you have with us to license your voice or that you have with the entity that you have given permission to create content with, that if we're helping to deploy and provision or license that content, that it is being used in a way that all parties had agreed on. So we have a content licensing and compliance arm too that helps to really kind of track and police some of that as well.
Great question. Thank you. Anyone else? Sure.
This is a little bit of a different topic, but maybe you can address it.
Sure.
I'm more concerned about, how you have standards against ownership and security against the voice biometrics, which is common in computer. The voice recognition and the biometrics that is stored, and how do you control the ownership of that? And are there standards being adopted?
Yeah, so voice biometrics and standards around that type of voice recognition and
I can take a stab at that. So that's why when we first moved to create a synthetic voice, we asked for that recording of the voice owner themselves saying, this is my real voice, this is Lauren Cowles, I'm giving permission to Veritone, whatever entity it is, to create this version of my voice. And then once we have that authentication piece, we also collect training data, which is, say an hour of you speaking that we train our machines on. So during the processing phase of creating our voices, we make sure that the actual real voice clip matches the training data provided. That way we know, somebody hasn't already created a synthetic version of the voice and they're trying to pass that off as, authentication or something like that. So there's a bit of matching up like an authentication clip with the training data that we receive to make sure that the highs and lows and peaks of the voices are actually, verified before we move forward with creating that synthetic voice.
There's also a number of standards across each of the different states. And I want to say it's national, it's either NSCL or NCSL. But there's each of the different, so for instance, I'm from Illinois. And there are interviews that take place where your voice can be judged, so to speak, in your interview. And I have a right to know that my employer is doing that. And that's the law within Illinois. So each of the different states, there's a whole host that you can go and take a look at. NIST also has excellent policy control as well, and the national standards and the AIF 360, how we handle AI in general around all of this. Those are some of the guardrails that are at least put in place from a technologist standpoint, but also it's generally pretty consumable from us as individuals to understand too.
Big question would be, is the company you're working with, do they have they read GDPR?
Right.
Have they read the EDPB guidelines on voice? Are they conversant with CCPA and the Illinois guidelines? Do they understand that an utterance becomes a personal, identifiable piece of information? And if that's not the case, we got a problem. But, there are a number of, as Jennifer said, a number of steps from there to protect PII, which is biometric. The dealing of biomarker is a whole nother thing, but that's for another panel discussion, which we'll have sometime else.
Yeah. Good question.
Anything else or any other questions? Well, thank you so
Thank
much
you.
Thank
for
you.
being here, and thank you to all of the panelists. I really appreciate your time.
Thank
Of
you.
course.
It's great to
Thank
be in
you.
person. Thank you very
Thank
much
you
for being
all.
here.
Yeah, thank you.